Hi everyone, welcome to this webinar. I do apologise, it's a recording. We did try to do it live, but the platform wasn't behaving, so we only got a couple of minutes in. So I do apologise for all of you who dialed in to see it live. We've recorded this pretty quickly afterwards, so hopefully you should be able to see it pretty quickly. But also, if you do have any questions, just email them through at the end, or you can send them through our support line through the website. So today we're talking about what the best lifting technique is, specifically to reduce the risk of lower back pain, because that is the most common cause of work-related back injuries, lifting. So I'll go through the research, I'll go through some of the evidence behind it, but I'll also want to talk about some of the things outside the research, because a lot of us are from a science background, and generally from science background, everything we do, we're taught that everything we do has to have evidence behind it, and the evidence comes from research. Now, the quality of that research is often not double checked. So a lot of the time we're making judgments based off research that may veer us in a direction that's not probably the best, that won't result in the best outcome. So it's very important, as most of you know, to use research as one piece of the puzzle, and using all your other tools, whether they be clinical tools, whether they be experience, whether they just be observation and opinion, but put all the tools together to come to a decision or to come to the right outcome. So that's what I want you to do today throughout this. Yes, we're going to go through the research. Yes, we're going to show some case studies. We're going to go through a whole heap of things. But at the end, the purpose is to throw all this information at you and to get you thinking about what is it that we can do to reduce lifting risk of low back pain for workers. So let's get into it. So a quick overview. We'll go through the background, the problem, the biomechanics of lifting, the research that's out there and the strength of that research, and the solution, if there is a solution. But I want you to have an open mind. It's very difficult as clinicians, but also as allied health professionals or doctors or safety professionals. It's very hard to be convinced against something that you've always believed. And so when I've been going through this, I've been thinking back to what I learned at university as far as the biomechanics of the spine and the injury risks and all of the research that was available back then. This is over 20 years ago, but that still sits with me, and a lot of it has been proven to be possibly incorrect. Yet when you're in that environment, the learning environment of a university, and you are learning this thing for the first time, it sticks with you. So it takes a lot of persuasion to get you thinking the other way. So today, just have an open mind. Yes, some of this you'll agree with, some of this you won't agree with, but that's all part of it. So my background, I'm a sports physio. I spent a lot of that time focusing on movement analysis, in particular movement analysis to prevent injuries. So I did a lot of work with rowing, repetitive loading, which is actually quite relevant for this particular talk, because rowing does put a lot of load on the lumbar spine in a flex position, but a lot of athletics as well. And it came down to using data to identify injury risks and then to reduce injury risk. So here's an example. This is measuring the forces generated by 8. So at the time it was 8 best male rowers in Australia to Beijing Olympics. But you can see there, these are the 8 very finely tuned athletes. But this is how the force was generated, and the peaks of these curves are all slightly different. So what that tells you is that every individual generates force in different way. You can train them to change that. But this is the case, this can be transferred to the workplace as well. You could watch 2 workers lifting a box or lifting something. They're both generating the force in different ways. So how I transitioned my sports skills across to the workplace health and safety, my mother sustained an injury. Sorry for those of you who've already heard these stories, but my mother sustained an injury working as a nurse in her early 60s, close to retirement, and it basically caused her an early retirement, but it's also caused a lot of pain and discomfort since 7 levels of her spine were fused because she was lifting a patient as a nurse. So all of a sudden I thought, how can that be? All this technology, all this methodology is available to prevent injuries with athletes, yet all of these workers are out there doing things that they should avoid, or they should know how to move more effectively to prevent injury. So as I transitioned across, we spent the first 3 or 4 years of this journey, this would have been 2014, 15, 16, doing movement analysis, seeing if what we've learned in the sports field can be transferred across to the workplace. So we did a lot of data collection, a lot of analysis on whether the environment in sports can be used as a base to learn about how to prevent workplace injuries. And it was quite successful. And that's why we transitioned a lot of it across. We had to modify the technology and the methodology, but a lot of it is still adaptable. And we launched the product, I think, about a year ago, based off 5 years of research. But the problem we're addressing today is specifically lifting, not all workplace injuries, but lifting in particular and how it relates to low back pain. So the current work-related low back pain accounts for an estimated annual loss of 118,000 disability-adjusted life years globally. Now, the reason why I put that statistic there is because it was a new one that came up about a month ago and I hadn't seen it before, so I thought I'd share it with you. Because I've never come across disability-adjusted life years before, but it does make sense. It's not just about the cost of the injury, frequency of the injury. We want to look at the overall impact of the injury, and I think this statistic does that well. Current injury prevention methods, include training and education, are not effective according to the research. However, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, this is from 3 or 4 years ago, does show that the number of serious claims for the lower back, and we know the primary cause of lower back injury is lifting or body stressing, it is coming down. It's come down 40% since 2000, so it's a long time frame, but it is slowly coming down, whether it's because of training, I doubt it, whether it's because of engineering, of less people doing physical work in 2000 compared to 2017, we don't know, but the incidence of lower back pain in the workplace is decreasing according to these statistics. So what is the problem? Lifting is the most common trigger of low back pain resulting in time off work. There's quite good solid research indicating that. But for people who already have low back pain, lifting is the most common cause of an exacerbation, but also it's the most feared and avoided activity. And that's a really important point. That's good research, again, that's come over the last sort of 4 or 5 years. But why? The reason being, there's a long-standing belief that lifting-related low back pain is due to the combined angular position, so the flexion, and load that happens in that position when you lift. That's what we've been taught a long time ago. That's what's still being taught to a lot of blue-collar workers or manual handling workers today. Is it true? This was all based on the cadavers in a lab where they found that the lumbar spine is susceptible to failure when repeatedly flexed and when flexion and compression are combined. That's where all of that information came from. And this is where it was derived. So if you think about it, a lot of these decisions are based on a clamp type device in a lab with a whole heap of wires on the spine of a dead person from who knows what background. So we've taken that information and we've all run with that. But we know there's so much more that goes on in the body, not just the structure of the spine, that impacts the load in lifting and that impacts the injury risk in lifting. So this is where a lot of the new thought processes come in about, well, yes, studies a long time ago did show that there's disc compression, there's disc degeneration when the spine is flexed, but that's in a lab. Does that actually happen out in the real world when people are lifting? Is that replicating what's actually happening when people are lifting? You've got abdominal muscles, you've got different levers, you've got so many different components that are being neglected in the lab when they've got a cadaver and they're loading the spine. That's something that we didn't consider a long time ago. What about other factors? So people with low back pain move differently to people with non-low back pain. We know that. There's a whole heap of good research showing that. So they move differently because of adaptive behaviors, fear avoidance, muscle imbalance. They move differently partly because of the cause of the problem, the cause of the pain in the first place, but they move differently because of the fear of flaring it up. So that's a big factor. Older versus younger workers, that's not new. Anthropometry, size, shape of the workers, fatigue. Now, there's mechanical fatigue, but also postural fatigue. That also impacts the loads through the lumbar spine when lifting. There's the environment. What sort of twisting and turning is going to be happening in an environment that's not happening in the lab? But then, of course, we all know the psychosocial components are huge. So let's get into the biomechanics. This stuff I could talk about all day. I won't bore you, but we'll go into the most important or the most key elements. And the first thing we've got to remember is when a worker is lifting, or when everyone is lifting anything, it's about generating a force to move an object. Now, we need muscles to generate a force. So the first thing you want to do is look at the old muscle length tension curve. So for those of you who haven't seen this, for those of you who know this back to the front, I apologize, but for those of you who haven't seen this before, basically it means the length of a muscle determines how much force it can generate when it contracts. So what this curve indicates is that a muscle in its mid-length, so if a muscle is really stretched, which is right off the right-hand side of the chart, then its capacity to generate force is less than if it's in the middle. Same thing if it's contracted, if it's really short, which is up on the left-hand side of the x-axis, its ability to generate force isn't that high. It's when it's mid-length and the overlapping muscle components, I won't get too technical, but when the overlapping muscle components are small, can't generate force. If they're too far, they can't generate force. It's when those components are at the right length, that's when force can really be generated. And that's the strongest part of a muscle. So a lot of the lifting involves getting the muscle in a position that it's the strongest. So here we go. This is a video showing an Olympic weightlifting technique, but then it compares to normal lifting in normal work environments. So this is one of the world's best weightlifters ever, a Chinese guy, and basically the point of this is to look at how maximal force is generated, looking at all the components, the base of support. So if you look about how far apart his feet are, the center of mass of the weight, which has to be over the base of support, otherwise you fall over, but also the muscle length and tension going through not just the lower back, but through the legs, the glutes in particular. So in that early phase, the muscle is put in a position, most of those driving muscles are put in a position where that length tension curve is optimal to generate force to lift that heavy weight. So this is the biomechanics at that top end. Now I'll just actually pause it there for a second. We're now going to look at three workers. I'll tell you now, of the three workers doing different jobs in different environments, one of them has a history of low back pain and the other two don't. So throughout this, I want you to think, and at the end, I want you to think about who you think it was, and I'll tell you who it was. But what I want you to do now is to look at a real world environment. It's not a structured weightlifting at a high level environment where everything is controlled. Now we're looking at the biomechanics of lifting in an uncontrolled environment. So again, look at the base of support, look at the center of mass of where and what they're lifting. But look at those length tension curves for the trunk, but also the lower limbs. So I'll unpause it. Whoops. I'll just speed it up. This is the joy of using video technology. So if you look at this worker walking across to pick up this object, clearly the center of mass of the object is too far away. He'll drag it towards him, but he has to lean there. The base of support is what it is. He hasn't really braced himself. But now, carrying the object, he is in a flexed position because the weight, if he's not in a flexed position, then the weight of the object would be more difficult to balance. I don't know because I've never lifted that object, but he was flexed forward as he was carrying it. Now here's another worker. Again, he can't really use his knees in this situation, or he's uses the legs and his muscles and his glutes in this situation because you've got the trolley in the way. So yes, this task could be redesigned so that he could be avoiding that position. But if you look, base of support, center of mass, they're out of his control at the moment. And there's one more. Now here we've got pretty standard objects, lifting from a height and lowering them down. And you'll see here, wide base of support, keeping the box close to his body, which is keeping that center of mass close, and using the legs especially the glutes and the thighs, to lower the box down without having to flex and use his trunk muscles. Now, I suppose you would argue that this is what you'd consider in training purposes as the best lifting technique or the best moving technique. However, of those 3 workers, this is the worker who had back pain. So the younger, the fitter, the stronger, the one who had the better theoretical technique was the one who had back pain from work. So cases like that, yes, you've got all of these other things to consider: the base of support, the center of mass, the generation of the muscles the length tension curves for the muscles to generate the force, and the environment. There's other things going on. So the biomechanics of the lumbar spine itself. We've got vertebral bodies, the bones in between that are the core of the lower spine, the structure. You've got the discs that enable the movement between them. That articular cartilage that is both between the discs and the vertebral bodies, but also in the joints. But then you've got the synovial membranes in the joints. You've got joint capsules, ligaments, neural tissue, and musculotendinous junctions. They're all a big component of the mechanics of the spine, of how it moves and the extent at which it moves, the speed at which it moves, and of course, we've got the muscles, but we're looking at just the structural components here. Now, when you talk to workers, when you talk to anyone about why lifting is a risk to the spine, they will say, I guarantee 100% of the time, it's because of discs and disc bulges. And this image on the left shows a theoretical disc bulge. Now, there are all of these structures are capable of causing pain in the lumbar spine. Every one of them. They're all important in lifting. They're all pain-producing structures, yet the discs are what everybody focuses on. Now, we know we could go out to any work site and get 100 workers, and we can scan them of all different ages. We can scan them, and we can identify which ones have disc bulges and which ones don't. We can then put that information over here. We can then ask those workers who has back pain. And we know that the scan results of people who have disc bulges do not correlate with the ones who have back pain. That's been proven for the last 10 years. There's been a lot of research showing that workers, people in general, may have a bulge on a scan without pain. You may have people with back pain and no disc bulges. Yet for some reason, and it's not for some reason, it goes back to that research that was early on showing that the cadavers that had the discs that would degenerate in the lab, that's where this all came about. And so since, for the last 20, 30 years, it's all been about the discs will bulge. If you bend, we're back and you lift. There's a lot of other things that can cause pain in the lower back other than discs, but discs seem to be the biggest fear component. And I've been guilty over the years, especially when I was a clinical physio. You would have a worker with back pain, their GP would send them for a scan, the scan would come back saying there's a disc bulge. The GP's already told the worker there's a disc bulge. So that's that. I suppose it's called a confirmation bias. You think, well, this is quite obvious here, this is quite obvious here, yeah, let's just link them. So the research behind it, the questions we want to ask are, does lifting with a flex spine increase risk of lower back pain? Would straightening the spine decrease this risk? And can workers adapt to different ways of lifting to make it safe? Now let's look at the research. There are, of the studies, the quality studies, there's a lot of rubbish studies, but of the quality studies, there are so many different ways of measuring whether the lumbar spine has even flexed. So you look at all of the research out there, you can't really put them all in the same bucket because they've all used different methods to actually measure the movement. Then they've also used different thresholds. So, excuse me. So is any flexion considered flexion? So 2 or 3 degrees of flexion, is that straight away saying, well, no, there's flexion, so you're in the flexion bucket, you're in the non-flexion bucket? Or is it, 40 or 50 degrees is considered flexion, in which case 30 degrees of flexion they're considering neutral. There are all of these thresholds and all these different ways of measuring it. So how do you compare? So does lifting, the first question, the most important question, does lifting with a flex spine increase risk of low back pain? What does the research say? So there was a good review done just recently that showed 4 studies measured lumbar flexion with the intralumbar angles as one of those methods that we just showed. And they found no difference in the peak lumbar spine flexion when lifting straight or stoop. 7 studies measured lumbar flexion with the thoracopelvic angles, so a different method, and they actually found that people with low back pain lifted with 5 degrees less lumbar flexion than people without low back pain. So that would indicate a compensatory movement pattern where people with low back pain are keeping their back straighter. Cause, consequence, we don't know. So the literature review went on to say 9 out of 11 studies reported no significant differences in lumbar flexion during lifting between the back pain and the no back pain groups. That's only 11 studies over a 40-odd year period. So the research is minimal. There's not a lot of research suggesting or trying to provide evidence behind lifting with a straight spine, lifting with a flex spine. So the conclusion was there's low quality evidence that greater lumbar spine flexion whilst lifting, that was another thing, all of the studies, none of them went above 12 kilos. So once you go above 12 kilos, there's no research at all suggesting that lifting with a flex spine is worse than lifting with with a neutral spine. So anyway, the conclusion was there was low quality evidence that the greatest lumbar spine flexion during lifting was not a risk factor for low back pain onset or persistence, or a differentiator between people with and without low back pain. But weak evidence, low quality evidence with only 11 studies, yet here we are, the majority of the world believe that lifting with a flexed spine will increase risk of low back pain. But this is the other thing. A lot of research done in a lab that I've already mentioned doesn't transfer well into practice anyway. So this is for those of you into podcasts, this is a really good podcast. It doesn't focus on injury prevention. There is a small component of movements, but this is a podcast basically going through how over the years, over the decades, research has been very, very poor at translating into practice for so many reasons. There's the incentives of the researchers, there's bias, there's the study group, there's all of these incentives behind the whole research world, the universities, that drive the outcome. So every time you read a study, you just think, all right, what's the underlying premise of this research? Does this PhD student or does this professor have a vested interest in making the results say this so they are better able to get the next grant? Or so that they get to present at the next conference saying our research was a success. So there's a lot of this underlying premise behind research that's done. So that's why we're going to say, all right, yes, that research says this. That's one piece of the puzzle, like I said earlier. So it's a really good podcast for those of you who love podcasts. So what's the solution? So the global advice is lumbar spine flexion should be avoided when lifting, and this risk can be reduced by lifting in a lumbar neutral position or a straight back. That's what we've heard for years. That's what people are still educating people. It's not bad, but is it good? Is it the way to go about it? There is evidence showing that implementing lifting device in healthcare and in the workplace has not been accompanied by reduced occupational low back pain. So you can teach everyone to lift in a certain way. It's not making a difference. Now, this is confirmation bias, which I mentioned earlier, and this goes for all of us. Our thinking is biased towards interpreting information in a way that confirms preconceptions. So if we were all taught that lifting with a flex spine, loading the spine in a flex position will damage discs, if there's little bits of information, if a patient presents in a certain way, that's what we'll go to. A worker will come in and say, I've hurt my back lifting. So you just straight away go, well, that makes sense because that's what I've heard before and that's what the research says. But that worker could have just spent 5 hours in a truck driving to a site, they've got out, and then they've lifted something. So it's not necessarily the cause of the injury. Or again, it could go back to scans, it could go back to so many clinical elements or so many parts of an injury But it always falls back to, all right, you were lifting, so that was the cause of the injury. So that was, the confirmation bias was from the Nobel Prize winning Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky. They're legendary behavioral economists. Thinking Fast and Slow is an awesome book as well if you want to read and know a bit more about those cognitive biases. But this is the key, adaptability. This is the really exciting stuff that hopefully you'll all take out of this. Because we know this transfers across everything. This isn't just lifting now, this is everything. If loads are slowly applied over time, we know adaptation occurs. The human body is remarkable at adapting to whatever you provide to it if it's applied slowly over time and there's not overload. So we know adaptation occurs in spinal structure tissues. We know it happens in the nervous system with neuroplasticity. So we know that nerves can regenerate. We know motor patterns and thought processes can regenerate. Motor patterns is a good one. So we know people can get more efficient at doing a task. A perfect example, I was on site with a client earlier in the week, and there was a guy, they were lifting big particle boards, and there was a guy who'd been doing it for years, and he was a bit bigger than the other guys, a bit older than the other guys, but he was efficient, he was smooth, and he was doing everything in a way that we measured data, and the high load movements were zero. Whereas these young guys who were there as temps, they were moving in a way that there was high load alerts quite regularly because they hadn't adapted to that task, they hadn't adapted to that load because they've only been doing it for a couple of days. So motor patterns, working out the most efficient way to move to get the force generated and to get the job done is key. Muscle strength, of course, we know people go to the gym because they go to the gym to stress the body so it adapts and becomes stronger. Psychology, this is a huge one. Confidence in environment, complacency in environment. We know the psychosocial components of injury are huge. So this is another big part of adaptability, especially with low back pain in the workplace. It is explaining to people that the spine's not as fragile as people think. And even then, when there are history, the low back pain is one of those incredibly grey areas where it's not like a structural tissue damage where you twist your knee or you roll your ankle and there's bleeding and there's inflammation and there's a repair process. We know that there's so much unknown about low back pain, but a lot of it stems from the concept of pain and the thought of pain. You go to any worker today and you go to them and say, if you hurt your back, what's the cause? They will say, oh, well, yeah, it'll be the disc that's ruptured or it'll be the muscle that's torn. But a lot of the time, there is other things going on. So the explain pain concept is great. If none of you have read it, I highly recommend you go and see it or you go and read it, or there's a lot of YouTube clips, but it basically explains that whole concept of mechanical pain versus the other elements of pain that happen through the neuropsychology. So, for example, if a worker injures themselves in a particular environment, so if a worker hurts their back lifting a box, they could go away, they could do the rehab, they come back to that environment, and the sounds and the noise and being back in that environment can trigger pain again. Nothing to do with the structures, nothing to do with the actual tissue damage in the back, but this is the process of chronic pain. So this is a good part of adaptability. We need to teach workers about the concept of chronic pain, and not just chronic pain, just the cause of pain. So this is a really interesting case study. A construction worker, 42 years old, an ex-athlete, basically says, my back's stuffed, 20 years of pain. And we hear this all the time from plenty of clinicians, plenty of people in work rehab would say, yeah, people just say, oh, yeah, I've hurt my back, but my back's been stuffed for years. That's a straight away red flag. 20 years of pain, unable to bend or sit. Scans were no worse than normal degeneration, but there was a bit of disc degeneration, a little bit. Initial assessment by the practitioner, fear avoidance, catastrophizing, rigid spine with all functional movements. Everything was done with a straight back. Everything was done with a straight back because that's what we were taught. Lumbar flexion, you move, it can increase the load on the spine and increase risk of pain. Treatment was about retraining movement patterns to increase flexion and confidence in moving with everything, not just moving the lumbar spine with lifting, but moving the lumbar spine with everything. And the results were great. He reduced his pain. It's a long process. So this was a case study that was an APA, Australian Physio Association publication just recently. But this is a common case. I remember going through this when I was a clinician. And it's a very common case in the workplace. You could go to work sites and see people with chronic pain and they'll say, my back's stuffed. Straight away, that's there. So anything that happens after that will be pinned to that. This is a big part of reducing lower back pain in the workplace, is trying to get around this and trying to educate workers about these concepts. So here's a clip that I found on LinkedIn the other day, which it doesn't just oversimplify, but unfortunately these ways of training people and educating people about lifting and lower back pain are still around, and a lot of people are still doing this. But the reality is, if you show this to a worker, one of two things is going to happen. The first thing is they're going to say, well, I don't have a stick coming out of my butt. I can't move like that. I lift it. Or they might say, oh, yeah, that makes sense. But then they'll go out and do what they've always been doing anyway. Excuse me. So seeing this sort of material still floating around these days is quite... don't get me wrong, there are points to this that are valid, like keeping the weight close to the body. But yeah, you saw towards the end there, lifting with almost their bum touching the ground. That's just ridiculous. So unfortunately, this is still the sort of mentality. There is no research whatsoever supporting this. So managing the load, this is the key. So using technology that's easy to use, easy to understand, engaging for the workers, and cost effective. So why is technology needed to manage load? Because you need to measure what they're doing. If you can quantify what they're doing, you can then, as that slide said earlier, you can slowly increase it and you can slowly progress it. And if it's too much, you can bring it back down. Managing the load is key, and using technology to manage the load. There's a lot of technology out there now. Some of it's very expensive, some of it's more cost effective, but it's about measuring what the workers are doing and managing that load. So here's a few examples. Here's a steelworks that we did some work out a while ago, and we measured the demands throughout a shift, and we worked out time distribution of that. So this particular site were really concerned about all the lifting and carrying they were doing. The reality is they spent 42% of their time bending. That's going to put more load on their spine than the lifting and carrying movement. So it's about using technology to get a better picture of everything, what's happening around the lifting, that could also increase the risk of low back pain, not just the lifting itself. Here's a housekeeping with a lot of, so they were cleaning rooms. And when you look at the demands of each task and you separate them out, you can then identify where cumulative load occurs. So for this one, you can see the first 3 or 4 tasks. So the blue columns, the back load, and the orange columns are the arm load. So the first 4 or 5 tasks were heavily loading the back, and the last 2 or 3 were heavily loading back. And then there was that period in the middle where there was less load. So if you stagger the load, it gives chance for the body to adapt. You load, you recover. You load, you recover. That adaptation will reduce the risk of injury or increase the body's capacity to do those tasks without risk of injury. Sorry about the cough. When I get excited, my throat gets a bit dry. I don't have COVID, so you won't catch it anyway, so don't worry about it. Managing load, food manufacturing, so task rotations and rostering. Here again, this is the same as that last slide, but over a longer period. This is over a full shift, and you can see there's a lot of load, especially in the back on that first hour and maybe that 4th hour. So we looked into spreading that load throughout the shift to encourage that adaptation, to minimize overload and fatigue and risk of injury. So in conclusion, there's weak evidence for the straight back technique that we've all known for so long. The key is adaptation through load management, making sure that each and every individual worker adapts to what the load is and what the physical demands are, and their body adapts the way their physiology and the way their genetics has allowed them to adapt. That's the key. Rather than trying to force them into this is the lifting technique, matter of here's what you need to know, here's what's safe, here's what unsafe, but here's what you need to do to adapt so you don't get injured, so you reduce your risk of injury, not just now, but into the future. But this is the most important thing. Those who talk should do, and those who do should talk. So there's so many times I've seen people instructing people on how to do tasks efficiently, do tasks with the safest possible way, but they've never actually done the tasks themselves. There is that whole participatory ergonomics concept of making sure the workers are involved. They're the ones who understand the load, the physical demands. They're the ones who do it all day, every day. You combine that with the scientific evidence and with the knowledge and with all of the technology. You combine them both, and that's the key. That's the bigger, and that's the solution at the end of the day. So if you have any questions, I do apologise that this isn't live and we can't just do them in the chat room now. But if you do have any questions, email them through or give us a call and we can have a chat. But thank you and apologies again that it wasn't live. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your week or weekend or whenever you're seeing this. And we've got another webinar. The next webinar is using AI to identify and predict injury risk and deliver safety training to workers based off their specific needs, automating that whole process, which is really exciting, and that's going to be the future of all of our professions. So that's our next webinar. So hopefully you can dial in for that. Hopefully the technology will work and we can do it live. In the meantime, take care, stay safe, and we'll talk again soon. Cheers.